In April 1945, the world was on fire, but in the heart of Germany, the flames were about to die. Berlin, the proud capital of Hitler's empire, was about to face its final hour. What began 6 years earlier as a war for conquest would now end in a city of ruins, where an empire collapsed, a dictator fell, and millions paid the price for a dream turned nightmare. The year is 1945. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army has become an unstoppable force. From the ashes of Stalingrad and the fields of Kursk, millions of Soviet soldiers now march westward through Poland, across the Oder River, and straight toward Berlin. After years of suffering and loss, the Soviets were determined to end it where it all began, inside the enemy's heart. Behind them lay a trail of devastation. Ahead of them, revenge. For Hitler, the reality was inescapable. The Western Allies were closing in from France and the Russians from the east. The Reich was surrounded, and Berlin stood alone. Inside Berlin, life had become a nightmare. The once grand boulevards were now trenches of mud and rubble. Women and children dug anti-tank ditches while the elderly patrolled the streets with old rifles. Every school basement was a shelter, every cellar a grave. Hitler ordered that Berlin must be defended to the last man. There would be no retreat. Posters promised glory, but the people knew better. There was nothing left to save. In his underground bunker, the Führer clung to maps and fantasies of counterattacks that no longer existed. He moved imaginary divisions on paper while the real army lay in ruins. By mid-April, Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front stood just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Marshal Konev's forces pressed from the south. Between them, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 40,000 guns, 6,000 tanks, and more than 7,000 aircraft. It was not just a battle. It was vengeance unleashed. The Soviets had waited 4 long years for this moment. They remembered the burning of their villages, the massacres of their people, and the million dead at Stalingrad. Now they would bring the war home to Berlin itself. On April 16, 1945, the sky over Berlin lit up as artillery thundered across the Oder River. In just 1 hour, the Soviets fired more than 1 million shells, the largest barrage in history. The ground shook, windows shattered, and the night turned to fire. German soldiers hid in bunkers, their faces pale, their ears bleeding from the noise. Above them, Soviet rockets streaked through the sky like burning comets. The defenders of Berlin knew then this was the end. When the shelling stopped, what was left was barely a city. Entire neighborhoods had vanished into dust. The Reichstag, once a symbol of German power, stood like a blackened skeleton against the sky. Civilians moved like ghosts through the streets, silent, broken, waiting for something to end their suffering. But the battle was only beginning. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet shells were already falling inside Berlin. The city was surrounded on 3 sides. In the bunker, the Führer refused to leave, choosing to die where his empire would die with him. Above ground, the streets filled with fire and fear. Every hour, another district fell to the Russians. Every minute, more lives were lost for a cause that no longer existed. "The guns have spoken," one Soviet soldier wrote in his diary. "The beast is in its lair, and we will end it." As the Red Army closed in and the Reich crumbled, the world held its breath. The final battle had begun, and Berlin was about to face its judgment. The thunder of war had reached Berlin. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. For the people trapped inside the city, the end had arrived, not as a whisper, but as an earthquake of steel and fire. April 21st, 1945, the Soviet army breaches the outer defenses of Berlin. Columns of T-34 tanks roll through the suburbs, crushing barricades and burning vehicles in their path. Each street becomes a battlefield. German soldiers, boys and old men alike, fight from doorways, basements, and ruined factories. The once proud Wehrmacht is gone. What remains are fragments. Scattered units, desperate and doomed. They were not defending victory anymore, a Soviet commander later wrote. They were defending a memory, and even that was fading. Smoke and dust choke the city as Soviet artillery pounds every corner. From the air, Berlin is a burning maze, a grey skeleton beneath a red sky. Inside the ruins, millions of civilians are trapped. Women carry water through streets filled with corpses. Children hide in basements as bombs tear apart the city above. Many had believed Nazi propaganda later that the Red Army would slaughter them. Now fear drives them deeper underground, praying for survival as both armies clash above their heads. A Soviet soldier later recalled, "You could smell the city dying. Bricks, smoke, and death, all mixed in the air." The noise never stops. Gunfire, tanks, screams, and the endless rumble of artillery. Night brings no silence. Only more explosions. By April 25th, the Red Army had encircled Berlin completely. The Germans were cut off. No food, no reinforcements, no escape. Hitler's generals begged him to surrender, but he refused. Inside his bunker, deep beneath the chancellery, he still issued orders to imaginary divisions. He raged, shouting that Berlin would hold, that salvation would come, but there was no salvation. Only ruin. Above him, the city was collapsing. Brandenburg Gate was in flames. The Reichstag, once a monument to German pride, was now surrounded by Soviet infantry, inching forward block by block. Every building became a fortress. German soldiers fought from shattered windows, firing Panzerfausts at Soviet tanks. Each time a position fell, the Soviets marked it with red flags, pushing deeper into the heart of the city. The fighting was brutal, personal, and merciless. Men killed each other with knives, grenades, and even bare hands. Flamethrowers turned rooms into infernos. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. One Soviet sergeant wrote, "It wasn't war anymore. It was slaughter." By now, even Hitler's most loyal officers knew the end was near. Still, they fought, not for victory, but for delay, for pride, for fear of what surrender meant. 20 meters below the burning city, Hitler's bunker had become a tomb. Inside, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke, sweat, and despair. The walls trembled with each explosion. Reports came in hourly. Every district lost, every division destroyed. Joseph Goebbels spoke of loyalty. Eva Braun smiled faintly, pretending not to hear the bombs. Hitler's hands shook as he marked imaginary troop movements on maps. He spoke of counterattacks that would never come. "The war is lost," one of his generals whispered. "The only question now is how it will end." Above ground, Soviet artillery turned entire blocks to dust. The smell of gasoline, blood, and burning wood filled the air. Bodies lay everywhere, soldiers, civilians, children. And yet, amid the chaos, the Red Army kept advancing. They had come too far to stop now. Every soldier knew Berlin meant victory, and victory meant the end. They fought not just for glory, but for the ghosts of their homeland, for Leningrad, for Kiev, for Stalingrad. "For every child they burned," one soldier shouted, "we will raise our flag over Berlin." By the end of April, the city that once dreamed of ruling the world lay in ruins. Berlin was dying, but history was being born from its ashes. And deep underground, one man still refused to face the truth. Above the earth, Berlin burned. Below it, in a concrete tomb, a man who once ruled half the world faced his end. The empire he built on fear and death was collapsing, and the walls were closing in. Deep beneath the Chancellery Gardens, 20 meters underground, lay the Führerbunker, Hitler's final refuge. It was dark, damp, and suffocating. The air was filled with smoke, sweat, and the smell of decay. Every few minutes, the ground trembled as Soviet shells struck above. Ceilings cracked. Dust fell from the lights. The once 1,000-year Reich had been reduced to a bunker and a map that no longer matched reality. In this tomb, Hitler's final days unfolded, surrounded by loyalists, secretaries, and generals who no longer believed in him. Reports from the front arrived by the hour, each worse than the last. Berlin was surrounded. Supplies were gone. Communications were breaking down. Hitler refused to accept it. He screamed at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. He demanded divisions that no longer existed.
"They have deceived me,"
he shouted.
"Everyone has betrayed me."
But no one dared to answer. In the silence, the sounds of artillery grew louder. The Soviets were now only a few hundred meters away. The man who once commanded millions now ruled over a few dozen frightened souls, trapped underground with no way out. In the corridors of the bunker, despair spread like poison. Joseph Goebbels still spoke of loyalty and destiny, his wife Magda writing farewell letters for her children. General Jodl wept silently over a map. Secretaries packed documents that would soon burn. Hitler's most trusted officers tried to persuade him to escape, to flee south, surrender to the Allies. He refused. He told them, "I will not leave Berlin.
"I will die here." Above ground, the Soviets pushed closer.
The Chancellery Garden was now a battlefield. Soviet tanks fired point-blank into the ruins. The end was measured not in days, but in hours. On the night of April 29th, Hitler gathered his remaining followers. In a small, dimly lit room, he married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. There was no celebration, no music, no joy.
Only the sound of distant explosions. Witnesses later said Hitler's hands trembled as he signed the papers.
He congratulated his officers, shook their hands one last time, and returned to his study. That same night, he dictated his final statement, his last will and testament, blaming the war on the Jews and his generals. Even in his final hours, he refused to take responsibility. April 30, 1945. Outside, Soviet artillery pounded the Chancellery. Inside, Hitler sat on a worn sofa beside Eva Braun. He wore his old grey uniform, his eyes sunken and vacant. At 3:30 p.m., he gave his dog a dose of cyanide, testing it, and he and Eva took poison together. A single gunshot followed. The guards entered quietly. Hitler was dead. The man who brought the world to ruin was gone, not with a speech, not in battle, but in silence. They carried his body to the garden above, poured gasoline, and set it alight as Soviet shells exploded nearby. The flames consumed the dictator and the dream he had forced upon millions. It was over, one witness said. There was no triumph.
Only relief. When Soviet soldiers entered the bunker days later, they found ashes, broken furniture, and the smell of death.
Outside, the red flag was already flying over the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi Germany's total collapse. The Third Reich had lasted 12 years. It ended in fire, blood, and ruin. Millions lay dead across Europe. Cities burned, nations were broken, and history itself was scarred forever. But at last, the nightmare was ending. In that dark bunker beneath Berlin, a tyrant met his end. But the cost of his madness would echo for generations. The war was nearly over, but for the soldiers still fighting above ground, the final act was yet to come. Berlin, a city once built to rule the world, now lay silent beneath a storm of ash. The guns still thundered, but everyone knew it was over. The final battle of the Second World War had come to an end, May 1st, 1945. With Hitler dead, Berlin was leaderless. But the fighting did not stop. SS officers still commanded pockets of resistance, shouting orders that no one wanted to follow. German soldiers, wounded and starving, fought out of fear rather than faith. Some surrendered with tears in their eyes. Others refused, firing their last bullets into the smoke before being silenced forever. Every street was a graveyard. Every building a tomb. The once great capital of the Reich had become a city of ghosts. Marshal Zhukov's Soviet troops advanced through the wreckage. Each intersection was taken with grenades and flamethrowers. Corpses lined the gutters. The smell of burning oil and concrete filled the air. The Reichstag, the Grand Parliament building, symbol of German power, stood ahead, shattered but still standing. Its domed roof was cracked open. Its walls were riddled with holes. But for the Red Army, it was not just a building. It was the prize, the symbol of victory. Zhukov gave the order, take it, at any cost. As Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag, gunfire echoed through the hallways once filled with political speeches. German defenders fought to the last man. Every floor, every staircase, every corridor was soaked in blood. Machine guns rattled in the dark. Grenades rolled down the stairs. The air was filled with dust, fire, and screams. By nightfall, the Red Army had reached the roof. Amid the smoke and chaos, two Soviet soldiers, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, climbed the ruins carrying a red banner. They raised it high above the Reichstag, but the red flag of victory is while German resistance finally broke, below. For the soldiers who survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad, this was not just victory. It was revenge. It was justice. We had carried this flag for 4 years, one Soviet veteran recalled. We had lost everything. Now we had won. On May the 2nd, the last German forces in Berlin surrendered. The streets were filled with silence. Not peace, but exhaustion. Soviet soldiers wept openly. They embraced each other amid the ruins, surrounded by the ghosts of the millions who had fallen. But the cost was unimaginable. Over 80,000 Soviet soldiers had died in the Battle of Berlin alone. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians were dead. Entire generations wiped away in a single final act of war. Berlin, once a symbol of power, had become a monument to destruction. In the days that followed, the Red Army buried its dead and fed the hungry. Survivors emerged from cellars, pale, silent, and broken. Children searched the rubble for food. The smell of death lingered in every street, and yet, in the ashes of defeat, there was life again. The first fires for warmth, the first bread baked in years, the first sunrise that did not begin with the sound of bombs. Europe had been through hell, and it would take decades to rebuild what had been lost. But the war, at last, was over. On May the 8th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was finished. From London to Moscow, from Paris to New York, the bells of victory rang. The world exhaled for the first time in 6 years, but in that silence, a question remained. Was it victory or survival? The war had killed over 70 million people. Cities had been reduced to rubble. The scars, physical and emotional, would last for generations. Yet, from that darkness came a vow, a promise that such horror would never happen again. We won the war, one Soviet soldier said, but we lost our youth. The Battle of Berlin was more than just the end of a war. It was the moment when the world changed forever. The Nazi Empire was gone, but a new struggle, the Cold War, was already taking shape. The ruins of Berlin would soon be divided by walls and ideologies. But for now, in May 1945, there was only silence, and the red flag waving over the ashes. The war that began with fire ended in fire. The dream of conquest was buried beneath the ruins of Berlin, and out of that ruin, a new world was born. Fragile, scarred, but free. The soldiers who raised the flag over Berlin did not just end a war, they ended an era. On-screen text. May 8th, 1945, the end of the Second World War in Europe, dedicated to the 70 million lives lost in the deadliest conflict in human history.